As the
Your
judge
Honor,
prepared
I
to
have
deliver
new
his
evidence
final
that changes.
ruling, Grant Harwood watched with quiet satisfaction. High had successfully stripped his wife of their mansions, their millions, and the reputation he had spent years polishing to perfection. He was only moments away from leaving her completely destitute. Then she finally decided to speak, and with only a few carefully chosen words, she began dismantling his entire life. The air conditioning system inside docket 277A of the Cook County Domestic Relations Division had stopped working. Yet the chill radiating from the plaintiff's table was powerful enough to cool the entire courtroom. Sitting perfectly upright in a custom charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars was Grant Harwood. Grant was the golden boy of Chicago commercial real estate. As the founder and chief executive of Harwood Legacy Group, he was celebrated for his ruthless business instincts and his dazzling million-dollar smile. That smile was absent in court. In its place was a carefully practiced expression of solemn exhaustion. Grant played the role of the weary husband flawlessly, a man who had simply outgrown his marriage and wanted nothing more than a peaceful, although expensive, escape. Beside him sat his lead attorney, Malcolm Voss. Voss was a shark wearing a silk tie, a senior partner at one of the most feared family law firms in the Midwest. He charged an extraordinary hourly rate to ensure that men like Grant walked away from their marriages with their fortunes entirely intact. Across the aisle sat Elise Harwood. If Grant was a violent storm, Elise appeared to be little more than a shallow puddle. She wore a muted beige twin set, and her hair had been pulled into a severe, practical clasp. The strain of the marriage had made her appear far older than she truly was. Throughout their long marriage, Elise had been the quiet wife. She did not attend the extravagant charity galas. She did not care about the flattering profiles published in Crane's Chicago Business, and she never created problems. While Grant worked punishing hours, Elise maintained their enormous Gold Coast estate. When his aggressive zoning practices attracted official scrutiny, she remained silent and baked cookies for the neighborhood association. She was quiet, cooperative, and, according to Grant's legal team, entirely disposable. Presiding over the legal destruction was the Honorable Judge Alden Merrick. Judge Merrick was a strict traditionalist with an almost sacred devotion to contract law. He had little patience for emotional pain, neglected marriages, or the moral failures of unfaithful spouses. High cared about ink. High cared about paper. Above all, he cared about signatures. Grant possessed the ultimate signature, Elise's name on a brutally restrictive prenuptial agreement signed shortly before their wedding. "Your Honor," Malcolm Voss declared as he paced before the bench, "the facts surrounding this dissolution are remarkably straightforward. Despite opposing counsel's desperate effort to confuse them," he gestured toward Grant, "my client built his corporation from the ground up. The prenuptial agreement, entered into voluntarily and with independent legal representation, clearly establishes that all business assets, holdings, and revenue generated by Harwood Legacy Group are his sole and separate property." Voss paused and gave Elise a patronizing glance. "Mrs. Harwood is entitled to the severance specified in the agreement, a one-time payment of $500,000 and the deed to the secondary vacation property in Wisconsin." He spread his hands. "That is what she agreed to receive." Voss turned back toward the judge. "Mr. Harwood's current net worth of $85 million was created through his singular vision, personal labor, and relentless dedication. The respondent made no contribution to the company's corporate structure." His voice became openly contemptuous. "She was a librarian when they met, Your Honor. She has not held conventional employment for many years. Awarding her half of this business empire would constitute a grotesque miscarriage of justice and a direct violation of a binding legal contract." At the respondent's table, Elise's attorney looked physically ill. Tessa Langford was brilliant and meticulous, but she worked for a small boutique firm. Throughout the litigation, Grant's attorneys had nearly drowned her beneath mountains of discovery documents. Every motion she filed was answered by several more. They had exhausted Elise financially and emotionally. "Objection, Your Honor," Tessa said. Her voice lacked its usual strength. "Mr. Voss is editorializing. Mrs. Harwood's employment history is not the central issue. The issue is the marital money used to support Harwood Legacy Group during the market downturn." "Overruled," Judge Merrick replied, peering over his reading glasses. "The prenuptial agreement expressly waives claims related to commingled operational funds, Ms. Langford. We have repeatedly examined the same ledgers, and your forensic accountant discovered no irregularities." Grant shifted in his chair and leaned toward Voss. He whispered something into his attorney's ear. Both men smirked. It was a subtle and cruel gesture. The universal expression of men who believed victory was already theirs. Elise did not react. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at an ordinary manila folder resting on the table before her. She had not cried during the hearing. She had not flinched when Voss described her as a lazy opportunist. She had simply remained quiet, waiting. Judge Merrick sighed and straightened the stack of documents on his desk. The sharp thud of the paper striking the mahogany sounded like the beginning of an execution. "Counsel, I believe every relevant argument has been exhausted," the judge announced. His gravelly voice echoed through the enormous room. "I have reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the financial affidavits, and the testimony submitted by both parties. He folded his hands. Illinois law concerning premarital agreements is clear. Unless there is evidence of severe coercion or documented fraud connected to the execution of the contract, this court must enforce the agreement as written. Tessa's shoulders dropped slightly. She reached over and gently squeezed Elise's arm. "I'm sorry, Elise," she whispered. "We tried. He concealed everything too well." Elise slowly turned toward her attorney. The softness usually present in her brown eyes had vanished. They were cold, focused, calculating. "I am prepared to rule," Judge Merrick continued, reaching for his pen. "In the matter of Harwood versus Harwood concerning the division of marital assets and the enforcement of the prenuptial agreement," Elise moved her hand. She placed her palm flat against the manila folder. "Stop him," she whispered. Tessa blinked in confusion. "Elise, it's over. Interrupting him now without a legitimate legal basis could result in contempt." "Stop him," Elise repeated. This time her voice was sharp enough to carry across the silent courtroom. Grant glanced toward her. "Open the folder, Tessa. Look at the date beside the highlighted entry." Tessa hesitated. Then she opened the manila folder. Inside was a single bank statement accompanied by a series of wire transfer records. The documents did not come from a bank in Chicago. They had been issued by Banca Pictet and CA, an exclusive private banking institution headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. Tessa studied the statement. She examined the date. Then she read the name of the account holder. The color instantly drained from her face. She turned toward Elise, her mouth slightly open. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. Her heart was pounding. "He asked me to clear out his home office safe before he changed the locks," Elise answered softly. Her gaze moved across the aisle and settled on her husband. He forgot that he had hidden his real life underneath the false one. Judge Merrick cleared his throat loudly. "Is there a problem, Ms. Langford?" Tessa stood so abruptly that her chair scraped violently across the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Your Honor," she began. Her voice trembled briefly before hardening into steel. "Before this court issues its ruling, the respondent formally moves to reopen the evidentiary record based on direct, egregious, and ongoing fraud perpetrated against both my client and this court." Chaos erupted immediately. "Objection!" Malcolm Voss roared, slamming his hand against the plaintiff's table. "This is completely improper." He pointed toward Tessa. "Discovery is closed. Counsel cannot interrupt the court's ruling and shout accusations of fraud simply because she dislikes the outcome." Grant's smug expression vanished. A tight, dangerous glare replaced it. He stared at Elise, trying to understand what she was doing. Elise answered him with a slow and chillingly empty smile. "Order!" Judge Merrick shouted. He struck his gavel once and glared down at Tessa. "Ms. Langford, Mr. Voss is correct. Discovery has concluded." His expression hardened. "Unless you possess evidence of monumental significance, I will deny your motion and sanction you for interrupting this ruling." "Your Honor," Tessa said, stepping away from her table with the bank statement in her hand. "Mr. Harwood submitted a sworn and notarized financial affidavit declaring his total worldwide assets under penalty of perjury." She held up the document. "He claimed that his net worth was $85 million. We have already established that," Judge Merrick said impatiently. "He omitted a subsidiary holding company," Tessa continued. Her voice carried clearly through the room. "A holding company that completely invalidates the prenuptial agreement under its morality and criminal conduct provisions." Voss laughed dismissively. "Your Honor, even if my client neglected to disclose an inactive limited liability company within an enormous portfolio, the omission of a minor asset is not grounds for invalidating an otherwise enforceable agreement." "I request that Mr. Harwood be recalled to the witness stand," Tessa said, ignoring him. "If he can explain this document under oath, I will withdraw the motion and accept the court's ruling without further objection." Judge Merrick looked at the paper in Tessa's hand. Then he looked toward Grant, who was gripping the edge of the table. "You have a very limited opportunity, Miss Langford," the judge warned. "Prove that this is not a waste of the court's time." He turned toward the plaintiff. Mr. Harwood returned to the witness stand. Grant buttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the witness box with an air of bored inconvenience. He repeated the oath, sat down, and carefully adjusted his cuffs. "Mr. Harwood," Tessa began as she approached him, "are you familiar with an entity known as Sterling Price Management?" Grant did not visibly react. "I am." "What is it?" "A third-party logistics and property management vendor. Harwood Legacy Group used its services briefly." "Only a vendor?" "Yes." Tessa nodded slowly. "Mr. Harwood, my client's sister, Celia Rowan, died tragically in an automobile accident. Do you remember that?" Malcolm Voss rose. "Objection. Relevance. Are we litigating a divorce or conducting a seance?" "Ms. Langford, where is this leading?" Judge Merrick asked, frowning. "It relates directly to the financial affidavit, Your Honor." Tessa turned back toward Grant. "Do you remember Celia's death?" "Of course," Grant replied. He softened his voice, performing sympathy for the courtroom. "It was a devastating period for Elise. I supported her through it. I even paid for the funeral." "You did," Tessa confirmed. "You also established a small charitable memorial fund in Celia's name, the Celia Rowan Trust." She studied him. You told your wife that it was a tax-deductible organization intended to support local libraries, which had always been her sister's passion. That is correct, Grant said. I consider myself a philanthropic man. Mr. Harwood, who is the primary beneficiary and sole executor of the Celia Rowan Trust? Grant hesitated. A flash of panic crossed his eyes. I believe it was created to benefit local municipalities. I would need to consult my tax attorneys. Allow me to refresh your memory. Tessa delivered the document to the clerk so it could be marked as Exhibit 414. A copy was given to Voss. Another was placed in Grant's hands. Voss looked down at the document. His eyes widened. He immediately turned toward his client, sheer disbelief spreading across his face. Exhibit 414, Tessa announced, is a certified statement issued by Banca Pictet and CA in Geneva. She faced the judge. It contains records of extensive offshore wire transfers. Harwood Legacy Group funneled enormous amounts of unreported real estate revenue through sterling price management. Objection! Voss shouted. But the force had disappeared from his voice. He sounded frightened. Tessa continued over him. The funds were routed directly into the Celia Rowan Trust, an offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands and administered through the Swiss bank. She lifted the document higher. That trust currently contains liquid assets exceeding $120 million. The courtroom went completely silent. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded like a hammer striking steel. Judge Merrick leaned forward and removed his glasses. $120 million? Yes, Your Honor, Tessa replied. More than twice the amount Mr. Harwood reported in his sworn affidavit. All color had vanished from Grant's face. The charismatic billionaire looked as though he might be physically ill. Those are corporate reserve funds, he stammered. It is a complicated tax deferral structure, completely lawful. Is it? Tessa turned toward the respondent's table. Elise rose, picked up another document, and calmly carried it to her attorney. Tessa stepped closer to the witness box. Mr. Harwood, if this were a legitimate corporate strategy, why does the authorization signature on the Cayman Trust documentation belong to Celia Rowan? Grant swallowed. He could not answer. Celia Rowan died before these offshore accounts were created, Tessa said. Her voice fell into a deadly whisper. The trust documents were signed and notarized after she had already been buried. Judge Merrick slammed both hands against his desk. Mr. Harwood, did you forge the signature of your deceased sister-in-law to create offshore accounts and conceal $120 million? My accountants. Grant looked desperately toward Voss, but the attorney had taken a step away from the table. He rubbed his temples, realizing that he might be representing a man involved in an international wire fraud and identity theft. But that is not the most remarkable part, Your Honor, Tessa said. She turned toward Elise. Elise was no longer staring down at the table. She stood tall, her posture completely transformed. The quiet wife had disappeared. In her place stood a woman who had spent years silently following a predator through the darkness. Because Mr. Harwood used Celia Rowan's identity to establish the trust, Tessa explained, he was required to name a legal successor in the event of Celia's death. She paused. Because Celia was already deceased when the documents were forged, the succession clause was activated immediately upon creation of the trust. Tessa carried the final document to the judge's bench. Under international banking law and according to the very documents Mr. Harwood commissioned to conceal his wealth, the sole legal owner of the Celia Rowan Trust and its $120 million is Celia's next of kin. Tessa turned and pointed toward the quiet woman in the beige twin set. My client, Elise Harwood. The silence inside docket 2 setup in A became absolute. It was the suffocating silence that followed a devastating collision before the screaming began. Malcolm Voss, a man who had built his entire career on never being surprised, physically backed away from the plaintiff's table. He stared at the documents as though they were contaminated. Aggressive asset protection was common in the high-stakes world of Chicago divorce law. Forgery, wire fraud, identity theft, and international money laundering. Using a dead woman's name were career-ending felonies. Mr. Voss, Judge Merrick said. His voice dropped into a dangerously calm register. I suggest that you speak with your client. From where I am seated, it appears that Mr. Harwood has not only committed perjury in my courtroom, but may also have implicated your firm in a multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy. Voss did not look at Grant. He looked directly at the judge. His face was pale, and his instincts for professional survival had overtaken his loyalty to the retainer agreement. Your Honor, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the sweat collecting on his forehead. I want the record to reflect clearly and without qualification that neither I nor any partner in my firm had prior knowledge of sterling price management or the Celia Rowan Trust. He gestured toward the documents. We relied entirely on the sworn financial disclosures provided by the plaintiff and his private accountants. Malcolm, what are you doing? Grant hissed. He reached out and seized his attorney's forearm. Voss violently pulled himself free. I am protecting my license to practice law, Grant. His voice was low and furious. Do not speak to me. Do not say another word unless you want to spend the rest of your life inside a federal prison. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding, Grant pleaded. He turned his famous smile toward the bench, but it now resembled a terrified grimace. It is a corporate loophole. My financial advisors in Geneva assured me. A loophole? Tessa interrupted. Her voice rang through the courtroom with newfound authority. She stepped toward the center of the room. Forging the signature of a deceased woman is not a tax strategy, Mr. Pete Harwood. She looked directly at him. It is a serious felony, and it places you in a truly extraordinary legal position. Tessa turned toward Judge Merrick. Your Honor, Mr. Harwood has two choices, and I am delighted to allow him to choose. She began walking slowly across the courtroom. Option A, he admits that the $120 million inside the Celia Rowan Trust belongs to him. She raised one finger. If he makes that admission, he also admits to hiding marital assets, committing perjury in his financial affidavit, forging the signature of a deceased person, and defrauding federal tax authorities. Tessa paused, allowing the possibility of prison to settle over Grant's shoulders. The prenuptial agreement would be immediately invalidated under its criminal conduct clause, and he would leave this courthouse in handcuffs. She raised a second finger. Option B, he maintains his innocence. He claims that he had no involvement in the forged documents and that the Celia Rowan Trust is entirely legitimate. A sharp smile appeared on Tessa's lips. But if the trust is legitimate, its succession provision became effective upon Celia's death. She stopped directly in front of Grant. And the sole legal heir to the $120 million is her sister, Elise Harwood. Tessa held his panicked gaze. So, Mr. Harwood, is it your money, in which case you face prison? Or is it Elise's money, in which case you lose everything? Checkmate. Grant's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. He looked wildly around the courtroom. He turned toward Voss, who was rapidly placing documents into his leather briefcase and distancing himself from the disaster. He looked toward the court reporter, whose hands flew across the stenography machine, permanently recording his destruction. Finally, he looked at Elise. For the first time in their marriage, Elise Harwood controlled the room. She rose from behind the plain wooden table. She no longer resembled a timid librarian. Her shoulders were no longer bowed. How? Grant whispered. The word escaped him involuntarily. How did you find it? Elise walked slowly toward the partition and stopped near the witness stand. You always believed I was stupid, Grant, she said. Her voice was not loud, but the courtroom was so silent that every word carried perfectly. You assumed that because I did not care about country clubs or Italian sports cars, I did not understand the way the world worked. Her eyes held his. You mistook silence for blindness. Grant swallowed, unable to look away. You changed the locks on the house, Elise continued, her tone almost conversational. But you forgot that I managed the household technology system. She moved one step closer. I installed your home office router. I configured the secure servers. Her expression remained calm. And you used the same password for your encrypted offshore email portal that you used for the home alarm system. She allowed the words to settle. Empire 1. A silent wave of shock passed through the small gallery. You spent years draining money from the company and moving the profits of our marriage into hidden accounts, Elise continued. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You wanted to ensure that when you finally replaced me with someone younger, I would receive nothing. Her voice trembled for the first time. But you used Celia's name. She slowly shook her head. You used my dead sister's memory as a corporate shell so you could rob me. Grant's face collapsed. I spent months downloading every wire transfer, every IP log, and every forged signature, Elise said. I watched you sit at that table and describe me as a lazy opportunist. Her voice became quiet and merciless. I allowed you to believe you had won, Grant, because I wanted you to experience exactly what you are feeling now. Elise turned her back on him. She walked calmly to her seat and sat with flawless posture. I have nothing further for this witness, Your Honor, she said. Judge Alden Merrick leaned back in his high leather chair. For a long moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the broken air conditioning system struggling to force air through the vents. The judge slowly replaced his reading glasses. The strict traditionalist who revered contracts above nearly everything else looked down at the prenuptial agreement on his desk. He picked it up with 2 fingers as though it were contaminated. Mr. Harwood, Judge Merrick began. His voice was rough and lethal. Throughout my career, I have seen spouses hide money beneath floorboards. I have seen them transfer cash to mistresses. I have seen them purchase cryptocurrency to avoid support obligations. His expression hardened, but I have never witnessed such an astonishingly arrogant and sociopathic display of financial fraud. Grant gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand. His knuckles turned white. Your Honor, please. Do not interrupt me, Judge Merrick roared. He slammed one hand onto the desk so forcefully that a pen rolled over the edge and struck the floor. You sat in my courtroom and repeatedly swore that you were a self-made businessman being exploited by a greedy wife. The judge pointed toward the offshore records. All the while you were operating an international financial scheme using the stolen identity of a dead woman. Judge Merrick retrieved his pen and clicked it with a sharp final snap. Mr. Voss, does your client have a preference between the 2 options outlined by Ms. Langford? Voss stood rigidly beside the table. Your Honor, my firm respectfully moves to withdraw as counsel. Motion granted, Judge Merrick replied immediately. He looked toward Grant. Mr. Harwood, you are now representing yourself, and I will not grant a recess. This civil proceeding concludes today. Judge Merrick pulled the prenuptial agreement into the center of his desk. A prenuptial agreement is a contract founded upon complete and honest financial disclosure, he dictated for the official record. The plaintiff intentionally, maliciously, and criminally concealed $120 million in assets. He raised the agreement. Therefore, I find the prenuptial agreement to be unequivocally null, void, and entirely unenforceable because of egregious fraud. Tessa closed her eyes and released a long, trembling breath of relief. Because the agreement has been invalidated, Judge Merrick continued, writing rapidly across the official order, all assets associated with Harwood Legacy Group, including the previously protected $85 million, are classified as commingled marital property. A strangled sound escaped Grant. You cannot do that! You are destroying my company! You destroyed your company, Mr. Harwood, Judge Merrick replied. I am merely signing the death certificate. He continued writing. I award the respondent, Elise Harwood, 60% of all domestic marital assets, including the business holdings, the primary Gold Coast residence, and the investment portfolios. The judge turned his attention toward the manila folder containing the Swiss banking records. As for the Celia Rowan Trust in the Cayman Islands, Mr. Harwood has refused to claim ownership of those funds on the record, presumably because doing so would immediately implicate him in a federal wire fraud scheme. Judge Merrick looked directly at Elise. The court therefore recognizes the trust as a legally binding entity belonging to the late Celia Rowan. He lowered his pen. Upon her death, ownership transferred to her next of kin. His voice carried clearly through the room. The $120 million held inside that trust are the sole, separate, and exclusive property of Elise Harwood. Grant collapsed into the witness chair. He buried his face in his hands. Howe was ruined. His business empire was gone. His reputation had been pulverized, and his accounts were about to be emptied. Finally, Judge Merrick said, turning toward the court clerk, prepare a complete transcript of these proceedings together with Exhibit 414. He glanced toward Grant. I am forwarding those materials directly to the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, accompanied by a formal recommendation that a federal criminal investigation be opened into Grant Harwood for perjury, identity theft, tax evasion, and related offenses. Judge Merrick picked up the wooden gavel. He looked at Grant. Then he turned toward the quiet woman in the beige twin set. Ms. Langford, Mrs. Harwood, outstanding work. He raised the gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the block. The sound was the loudest thing Elise had ever heard. It sounded like the door of a locked vault finally opening. The courtroom began to empty. Malcolm Voss hurried through the double doors, abandoning his former client inside the witness box. Grant remained seated, staring blankly at the floor. A billionaire had been reduced to an accused criminal waiting for a federal indictment. Elise stood. She did not celebrate. She did not walk toward Grant to deliver a final, cruel remark. She simply collected her purse, smoothed the front of her beige skirt, and walked toward the exit. Tessa hurried after her into the hallway. The marble courthouse corridors were warm and airless, yet to Tessa, the air had never felt clearer. Elise, she breathed, still overwhelmed by adrenaline. We did it. She stared at her client in disbelief. I cannot believe we actually did it. You are going to become one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. Elise stopped near the elevators. She looked through the large glass windows at the crowded city streets below. Sunlight broke through the heavy clouds and cast a golden glow across the skyline. I do not care about the money, Tessa, Elise said softly. For the first time, a genuine and peaceful smile touched her face. I am going to give most of it away. She looked toward the city. I will build libraries in Celia's name. Her voice softened. Real ones. The elevator chimed, and the heavy metal doors opened. Then what will you do? Tessa asked as she stepped inside beside her client. Elise pressed the button for the lobby. She studied her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked older, but she also looked unbreakable. I think, Elise said as the doors slowly closed, I'm finally going to start making some noise. And that was how the quiet wife delivered the ultimate masterclass in revenge. She did not merely defeat Grant at his own ruthless game. She overturned the entire board and walked away with the empire he had tried to steal from her. What did you think of Elise's devastatingly patient strategy? Have you ever watched a narcissist become trapped by the very scheme they created? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this courtroom twist, press the like button, share the video, and subscribe for more incredible stories.